After the 2018 Classic Tetris World Championships, the NES Tetris scene saw exponential growth in its player base and its skill ceiling. While some of the top veteran players had already started using adjustments in their game, this was nothing like what was to come. From late 2019 to 2020, a new stacking meta centered around adjustments started to grow, spearheaded by players Coffee and Sodium Overdose, which has shaped the way players stack today. In this video, I'll be going over just about everything regarding the basics of adjustments, including what they are, how to see and perform them, and other miscellaneous topics regarding adjustments. Firstly, what even is an adjustment? Adjustments are the repositioning of the active piece to make room for the next one. In response to seeing the incoming next piece, players will adjust their current placement to accommodate for the next. Adjusted placements are usually not the default decision most players have, but if done correctly can lead to a board much better than any default move would. As an example, take a look at this board with the current piece being a Z. The default move would be to place the Z in columns 1 to 3. This not only is a perfect fit, leaving no holes, but it creates a nice downward slope, making this board much safer to deal with. This situation changes once we factor in the next piece. With our current board, there isn't a great spot for the S. Not that any of these placements are terrible, but we can definitely do a lot better. Instead of the default placement for the Z, we can instead adjust for the upcoming S, placing the Z in columns 3 and 4, which leaves a perfect spot for the S in columns 1 and 2. Every sequence of pieces has the potential for adjustments, and they come in many forms. Some simply move or rotate the current piece for the next. Some set up tucks. Some set up spins. And some even set up spin tucks. There is a certain aspect of risk versus reward when it comes to adjustments. Reacting to and performing the proper adjustment may prove difficult, especially at faster speeds. Messing up your initial placement when going for adjustments can easily ruin your board. This is why players don't always go for adjustments even if they do see them, due to the high risk of a slightly better board simply not being worth it. Another aspect of risk comes specifically while using the dash playstyle. Performing adjustments with dash comes with the added danger of losing your dash charge, which can lead to certain death in some cases. Finally, adjustments are not always the better move depending on the stack, so it's crucial to understand when and when to not set up specific adjustments. As a side note, one possible misconception is when a commentator says something along the lines of a micro adjustment.
Those micro adjustments?
When they say this, they are just talking about adjustments, and it's not something separate. Now that you have a general definition of what adjustments are, here are 5 specific common adjustments that you'll regularly see players use in competition. Now that you know what adjustments are, how do you find them in-game? A fundamental aspect of looking for adjustments is pattern recognition. When high-level players see a board with their current piece in mind, they are instantly able to recognize where they can and cannot perform certain adjustments before the next piece even shows. Take this board for example. What instantly sticks out without even knowing what the pieces are is the small pit in columns 3 to 6 and this bump in columns 7 to 9. Suppose my current piece was a square. While the default move would be to place it in columns 4 to 5, I also recognize that with this specific formation, I can adjust the square for a Z-spin, placing the square instead in columns 2 to 3. Now suppose, using the same stack, that my current piece was a T. The default move would be placing the T in columns 7 to 8, but I recognize this bump as a possible J or I adjustment that would instead place the T in columns 8 to 9. Being able to see patterns like these is essential to mastering adjustments. Having to recognize many patterns may seem very daunting at first, so what are some ways you can practice seeing adjustments? I would say a great way of practicing pattern recognition is by watching games, especially rewatching your own games while only focusing on adjustments. This allows you to use a completely different lens to experience the same game you played without having the pressure of actually playing. Additionally, watching the games of top players can help you learn new adjustments that may not be so obvious to detect. It helps to observe board states, piece sequences used, and how much each adjustment would benefit to stack. The easier you're able to recognize adjustments, the easier it becomes to actually implement them in-game. While knowing and seeing specific moves is great, when it comes time to actually use them, adjustments come down to muscle memory. The pressure of being in a real game can affect how you think, so be sure to supplement your studying with active practice if you really want to get good at adjustments. Now that you have a grasp of learning and recognizing adjustments, how do you make performing them easier? Seeing adjustments and performing adjustments are very different in difficulty. While seeing only requires pattern recognition, when performing adjustments, you must also take into account the time it takes for you to react to the next piece, and the certain inputs needed to get the piece to its intended location. By the time you react to the next piece, your current piece would have already fallen a few rows, forcing you to scramble into inputs with the limited time you have left. To make this process easier, here are some tips for performing adjustments. It's always a good idea to know what adjustment you'll be attempting before you actually go for it. With the adjustment in mind, anticipate ahead of time your desired next piece. This is so if it does come, you are already mentally prepared to go for it, decreasing unnecessary time needed to think. Always have a backup if the desired piece does not come. This backup usually just being the default position. Even if you don't see anything, if the default move is not clearly the best move, you should still prepare yourself for an upcoming adjustment. If you're looking for one and manage to spot it before the piece locks, there still may be time to react and follow through with the maneuver. What if your backup is just too far away or requires too many inputs to do? In these specific situations, players will hover their pieces in areas and orientations where it is just as easy to attempt the adjustment as it is to attempt their default position. For an example of the adjustment being too far, look at this board with the current piece being a T and the adjustment being a VITS. To get from the adjustment to the default position, or vice versa, requires you to move 5 times, which is pretty tricky to cross-map, especially at this height. Instead, we can hover the T in the middle of both positions before committing to any movement. Now, going for the default move only requires you to move 3 times, and the adjustment 2 times, which is much easier to manage than the initial 5. For an example of input intensity, look at this board with the current piece being an L, and the adjustment being an LJ Chorion thing. To go from the adjustment to the default position requires 2 rotation inputs, which are typically much harder to do fast compared to movement inputs due to the various playstyles only focusing on how to increase movement speed, not rotation speed. Trying to adjust by rotating twice, especially on 19+ speeds, is very difficult. Instead, we can hover the L in the orientation between the default and the adjusted placement. This lowers the amount of rotations needed from 2 to 1, which is much easier to manage. Adjustments are very useful and will elevate your game, however, they do have certain drawbacks to them as well. As stated earlier, there's always an element of risk involved. In the heat of the moment, messing up an adjustment becomes very easy to do, which can seriously screw up your board.
That was a very sad below.
A more obscure drawback, however, is how players develop an over-reliance on adjustments. Note that this is less of a problem with players just starting out and applies more to players approaching a higher skill level. When this happens, players start to disregard basic stacking fundamentals and devote all their attention into finding whatever adjustment may be possible. This would be like a player going for an adjustment in the middle of their stack when they could just be building out their left. In my opinion, if you ever find yourself in this position, try playing out games where you're only focusing on default moves and make yourself blind to any adjustment. This should help you attune to a better balance between adjustments and default moves. Always remember that adjustments are just supplements to improve your game, and should not be what your game entirely revolves around. Now that you know everything about finding and performing adjustments, when should you start implementing them in your game? There isn't really a specific PB range where you should start learning adjustments, so evaluate yourself as a player and go at your own pace. If you're just starting out at NES Tetris, the ability to learn and perform adjustments is always there, but know that adjustments are nothing if you can't stack or react in the first place. Learning general stacking fundamentals, getting used to the higher speeds, and mastering your playstyle should be much larger priorities. But there's no harm in giving the occasional adjustment a try, even if just for fun. When you're comfortable with the faster speeds and able to start noticing nicer moves if only you knew what piece was next, then adjustments could be worth your time. If you were expecting a specific point, at the very least, I would say if you're a Max Out Plus player and have not yet started implementing adjustments, it would be a great idea to start if you still have the desire to improve. With all that out of the way, I hope you're able to grasp an understanding of adjustments. Firstly, a massive thanks to Coffee for helping me revise the script throughout all stages of making this video, and for always giving me feedback whenever I asked for it. The finished product would be nowhere near as concise and accurate without his help throughout the whole process. Another special thanks to E-Flat7 for creating the Tetris block tool program, which I used extensively throughout this video to make the board examples. Without it, this video would probably not be possible to make, or at least be a lot more tedious. Finally, shoutouts to Fractal, Sodium, Miles, and Dog for giving some suggestions on the script and thumbnail. Thanks for watching!